Let us begin. This is the second community call. The first one will be loaded into the library, but the first one, just to glance back over, was a top level look at emotional intelligence and some of the what, where's, whys, and hows of that, which basically allowed us to kind of like get into some of those things and consider some of those things, but not necessarily have a huge amount of depth. What we're going to do as the community calls go along, and it will be quite a growth and exploratory structure. I've got my ideas which I have in place, but then there's obviously the opportunity for people to have input, ask questions, and for it to evolve in that kind of way. But initially, we're going to take some of the areas of emotional intelligence that you would expect to see from frameworks. So today, we're going to look at the initial part of what constitutes as the critical part. Becoming more emotionally intelligent requires the idea of having awareness as a foundation and the ability to self-reflect effectively, and also to be able to understand what you've become more aware of. Awareness is essentially the start, and when you give yourself time to understand awareness is the start of everything that needs to change, you realize you can't run a race without getting to the start block. You can't build a strong house without having a foundation that is solid, that is considered, and that does have a certain level of robustness about it. When we go into the idea of awareness, it really has to be looked at as the part that if we don't look at first, we won't be able to move through into regulation, into relationships, understanding performance. And a lot of what awareness also must incorporate is the relationship that you have with yourself. So the start point of awareness is, what relationship do I have with myself, and how does that exist within the moment? What awareness isn't, it's very much a measured construct which doesn't ask you to over obsess on emotions. And this is where we can have the tendency, if something becomes quite powerful for us, or it becomes new, or it is new rather, or it has a sense of novelty about it that attracts us, we can become obsessive over those things. So, for example, if you've got a client who has been and started to understand and become more aware, becoming transfixed on a particular emotion or obsessing over emotion and becoming past a certain balance of awareness can actually be quite negative. Obsession isn't awareness. Awareness isn't obsession. They're two very different things. And to be able to understand where someone is potentially becoming over obsessed and becoming aware to a detrimental level is also important. So we can't just say, well, awareness is fantastic, awareness is great, let's be more aware, because at some point that can become detrimental if that person is becoming obsessed with that particular emotion or thought processes that they're having. An anecdote around the level of awareness that can become detrimental is if you become aware of negative emotions. So having a negative emotion is obviously something where we would expect to have on a day-to-day basis, on the basis that you have stuff that happens, right? Negative emotions, they come to you and you feel them. Sometimes that might be anger, frustration, sadness, any of those ones. Now, if you have a predispensation to become overly aware of that and then latch onto that and move into that obsession, we can find ourselves almost self-prophesizing more negative emotions and potentially spiraling. So awareness isn't becoming obsessed. Awareness is noticing and seeing and observing. So it's quite important to think if you were to have a ball that was floating along past you in a swimming pool, awareness would be watching the ball float towards you and potentially float away or just bob around in front of you. Becoming obsessed would be clutching onto the ball and holding it and just keep staring at the ball. So imagine that as a sense of awareness isn't clutching and grabbing it, it's just watching it come and watching it do whatever it does next. Awareness isn't trying to over explain things. Awareness isn't trying to give an explanation that rectifies the situation, or it's not trying to give an explanation that justifies a certain. It is, like I said, an observation. So we don't need to explain a feeling. It feels wrong. It feels right. I feel sad. I feel happy. Feelings, emotions, they come, they exist. We don't have to explain it, and we definitely don't have to explain it in the awareness part of emotional intelligence. It's very much an observational perspective, point of view. And much to the point where there's no fixing. We don't fix something that we're aware of. That comes after. If you rush into trying fixing things and trying looking at the nuts and bolts of it, that's when you can often make adjustments potentially unnecessary or go down pathways which aren't necessarily the right one to go down and consequently make yourself more work. So it's important when we think about how the phased part of emotional intelligence, where we look at the regulation or the interactions that you have with other people within the relationships aspects, is that that's where things start, you start to lean into the adjustments and the fixing or the strategies that will support you in making those things better for you within your life. When we observe, we're not looking to, when we become more aware, we're not looking to create a positive standpoint or a negative standpoint. We're not aware, we're not looking at something and giving it a plus or a minus. We're just looking at it, and we're being in a situation where we can make a critical observation and say, well, this is what's happening. Is it positive or negative? It doesn't matter. We're not discussing that at this point. No, how are you feeling? I'm feeling like I'm overwhelmed. Okay. Oh, it's terrible. It's so bad that I'm overwhelmed. Well, no, but we're not discussing that. That's not, we're just waiting to make those observations and log those observations and note those observations. And you can move quickly from awareness into then, okay, well, what can we do to regulate? It's not necessarily, you can do that within one session with a client. You can work with someone in a very ebbing and flowing backwards and forwards. But if something's being observed and someone's elevating their levels of awareness around something, that is the focus and that's what should be done. Why does awareness matter? If you have the opportunity to accurately name something, then you stand a chance to be able to tame it. And it's something that not having the awareness of what feelings or emotions might be coming to you as an individual, or what the client's emotions are, which they're feeling, to be able to accurately name them and that they can have a vocabulary in order to name them will give them a chance of being able to make sense and being able to put together a puzzle of what's going on and see a picture, and a clear picture at that. When we think about the precision of the feeling, it is important when when the emotional intelligence levels increase, the accuracy and precision of what I'm feeling and when I'm feeling it increases. And I've worked with people over the years where people have a bit of a blurred, bit of a fog of what emotions might be seen or might be feeling through opaqueness. And then as that starts to become clearer, they start to be able to really name those emotions that they're feeling it with no fog, very transparent, and they can see that. And that's when you start to see the capabilities of an individual to make better decisions, when that precision and that awareness of that precision starts to increase. The precision side of things is important to be able to go to the next level of regulation, the next construct of the emotional intelligence aspect, and being able to create a strategy that will positively impact. So getting accurate first is important. And what we need to get accurate around is partly the intensity of the emotion. So sometimes we have a outcome that creates a level of intensity. Initially, we can feel that spike and it can go up. And then after, it can drop down in quite an abrupt way. However, if we hold on and become obsessed with that particular emotion that we've become aware of, we can amplify the intensity of it and elongate that time that it stays up at that intensity in an unnecessary way. So here we have the awareness matched with being able to then step back after you've been aware of it because you've named it accurately with precision, and then that will have a positive impact on the intensity of it. You're clear, your clarity becomes apparent, but also the intensity will drop down. So having a level of awareness, precision, and accurately naming it will have a positive effect on the intensity of the emotion that you're having, the feeling that you're having. The levels of awareness and how that impacts choices that we make, those that are more aware, emotionally intelligent, make better choices. So the levels of emotional awareness and intelligence, consequently, as a construct, overall construct that's built up, has a net positive impact on choices in life, in coaching, and in leadership. Awareness, I think this is a really good segue into this point here. Awareness can be the difference between a reaction and a response. And if you have, let's say, for example, a container that has a sponge, layer that fills part of the containers, and then you've got some sort of scene underneath of like little toys, all like enjoying life, and then you pour water on the sponge. Now the sponge is a certain thickness, and the water will permeate through the sponge. Now, the thicker the sponge, the slower the water will permeate through and will subsequently just drip down and drizzle. Whereas if it's a thin layer of sponge, the water will permeate quicker and there will be a torrential downpour into the little scene at the bottom of the container where everything is. And for some things, you don't need to have a particularly thick sponge. You can just observe quite readily decide what kind of response you're having. But there are some contexts and there are some situations where you do need a thicker sponge. You need to let that emotion permeate into the sponge, travel through the sponge at a sensible rate, and then as it comes out the other side, i.e., the re response, it comes through as a response and not a reaction. But that's not to say that sometimes in life you need to react to things, because you do need to react to things sometimes, but it's what is my situation? What's the context that I'm in at the moment? Do I need a thick sponge to slow this down, or we got a thin sponge and I can just quickly get through and react how I need to react? And a lot of that can come down to, you know, the environment you're in, the nature of the conversations you're having. If it's with clients and you're working with clients, being in a position where you can support them to be able to make the decision around the thickness of that sponge as a coach is what an objective should really be, so that they can make better decisions and respond accordingly to the different contexts they're in. And as coaches, I think sometimes we might be faced with feedback that comes back to us as from people, or a situation that might unravel within a coaching experience where we're delivering sessions or something. And we also need to go, okay, in this situation, oh, okay, I just need a bit of a thicker sponge there. Let that go through before I respond as a coach, before if I was to react, that could cause damage to the coaching relationship. So there's almost like a duty of responsibility on the coach to be able to manage that thickness of sponge for them as a coach, but then also to support their clients being able to understand that as well. It's almost like it's the gap. It's the gap of stimulus and hopefully response rather than reaction, to be conscious of the space there and give it the breadth that it needs to, so the response is the desired one is the key. And you can only be able to do that if you have an awareness level at the right amount. Too low awareness and whoosh, reaction, not response. The emotions meter. This is quite a useful tool that often has a powerful impact on increasing a client's vocabulary around emotions. Energy, pleasantness, and obviously we can see there that the colors on the emotions meter orientate the different kind of heat that is associated with a particular emotion. And I've used this in various different, I've used this in coaching, I've used this in teaching, I've used this in the various different therapies, etc., that's been delivered. And it's an incredibly useful tool as a coach. If you're sitting there having a coaching conversation, whether it be online, a check-in, or whether you're in a group environment, whatever, to have this, obviously, you might have it to hand physically, but if you can have it mentally to hand, is obviously a quite fortuitous thing to be able to do. So when you're having conversations with clients and you're talking around how are you feeling, and they're struggling to maybe come up with a certain word, or they can't quite conceptualize what they're feeling, you could say, well, is it a cold feeling? Is it a hot feeling? Is it a feeling that's warm? Do you feel like it's a natural feeling? Do you feel calm? And what color? And you can start to bring in the different spectrums, which give them the opportunity to start to verbalize what they might be feeling. And one thing that is important here when we think about scope of practice as a coach, when you talk about emotions and you start leaning into certain aspects of emotions and why those emotions are happening, you can be starting to talk about some quite visceral conversations, some areas which could be quite challenging for you as a coach to talk about in some cases, but also for the client to talk about. So whenever you're in those situations, it's always a good idea to sense check with yourself, your practice and your experience levels in your areas which you can and feel comfortable going into as a coach, but critically also sense check with the client as well, where they're at, if they feel comfortable, if they're withdrawing around talking around emotions and you're talking about these things and you feel like they're shutting the conversation down, then that's, as a coach, when you need to just take your foot off the gas a little bit and leave that into a little bit of a time phase and maybe come back and revisit it later on if you feel that's appropriate. So one of the things with contracting and recontracting with coaches and clients is that if you get to a point where you feel your relationship as a coach is changing with the client, having the conversation around that and not just assuming that that's the nature and the way in which the relationship is evolving is an incredibly important thing to do. And I've worked with people which have started off in one capacity and have ended in a very different capacity. And all through that time frame, there has been both informal and formal recontracting within the relationship, because as someone opens up and they start talking about emotions on a higher, on a more specific level, it's a good idea to do that from a practice point of view and an ethical point of view as a coach. But when we are talking about emotions, there's a few things that we need to be aware of to be able to conceptualize what's going on for this person, to be able to understand the pieces of the puzzle which might be coming together depending on the experiences that they're having. So the actual emotions themselves is a pretty good thing to be connected to. And as we were speaking about, the precision and the naming of those is very important. The intensity of the emotions. So let's say, for example, you have someone who feels elevated levels of stress and frustration and anger around something. One of the things that can sometimes cause is then a physical reaction or an outburst or an argument, or that can go into a certain direction that has negative connotations further down the line. So being aware of the intensity and for them to be able to observe the intensity of that emotion is really, really important. I'm a fan of Lica scales, 1 to 10, 1 to 7, one, whatever it doesn't really matter what numbers you put on it, but if you give someone a spectrum of which they can pinpoint themselves, it's incredibly useful, really useful when you have it in RPE, when you're training. What level of exertion is this? 1, you're on the sofa. 10, you're in excruciating pain, you can possibly move anymore, right? Well, having that same setup for emotions is really important as well. And actually, when you think about combining that with a training setup or a coaching setup that you have, having that integrated into that is really important. And having it as, you might not use it every time, it might not necessarily be something that your client has to utilize on a session by session basis, but it might just be on session 7 when there is this emotional foray going on and there's some chaotic something, and you can dip into it and go, okay, well, let's just stop now. How intense is this? How intense is this emotion you're feeling? To be able to have that as a tool that the client understands, you understand, and has been talked about previously and can be lent into at the appropriate time is very important. So intensity scales of those emotions. And if you think about we tend to speak more on the negative emotions anyway, because they have the detrimental effect. But actually, positive emotions can be really useful to get people into a better trajectory. So if you're thinking about someone who has a feeling of joy or a feeling of contentment or a feeling of happiness around something, by having them become more aware of that intensity and being able to elevate that intensity and focus on that intensity, visualize it going from a 3 out of 10 to an 8 out of 10 of joy. Well, how can you increase that level of joy, optimism, or contentment? What would be the way in which you would increase that intensity? That can start to shape and frame a much more positive direction. So you do, as we've always had the negative and the positive, but you can use and be aware of intensity of emotion for a positive as well, and that can be really, really useful. Duration is one of those that if something lingers around for a long time, it doesn't have to be high on the intensity scale. It can actually be quite low, but because it's there continuously, it can be quite problematic. So someone is and has a low level of sadness. It's 3 or 4, but it's there for like 4 weeks. And actually during that 4 weeks, their nutrition is particularly bad. or they don't go to the gym as much as they should, or they don't move, they don't get up. It's like, okay, well, this low level of sadness that is only scoring 4 out of 10 on the intensity, but is here for the duration of 4 weeks, is actually having a negative effect on your decision making, your impact on your health and well-being and lifestyle choices you're making. So actually, the duration is really, really important because ultimately it can be a real covert sneak in the back door if it's a long time and it doesn't go away or it's not resolved, it's not aware of, and it's not spoken about, it can have that effect. When we think about repetition, cycles, so we all know when we're at work or we've got clients that have got end of Q3 coming up. It's a famous line that is, I think. End of Q3. Oh yeah, just got to get through Q3 or Q4, whatever, But ultimately, we go round in cycles and repetitions, and being aware of that repetition, this person is going to more than likely become more stressed, is going to become more frustrated. When? Well, when was the last time? Don't know. Well, you should do. As a coach, you should know what their repetitive cycles are of emotional fluctuations, positive and negative. So if you've got okay, I know that at the end of this phase, or they will do X, Y, and Z, and it will boost up their positive emotions. Right? We need to latch on. We know that this is a window where we can really foster these positive emotions and have a positive effect on this individual. So both positive and negative again, but the repetition, it's just, you see people go in cycles all the time. And as a coach, if you're aware of it and they're aware of it, we need to do something about it. It's no good just the repetition, the repetition, the repetition. But there is more to it than this. There is always a network of influences amongst how we feel and the emotions that we're experiencing. For example, if we have authenticity and values as a key aspect in someone's life and how this networks into their emotions, we can really see a sense of fluctuation based on if someone is being able to be authentic or if someone is living through their values. And as soon as someone is having to mask up more than they want to, or more than they actually are willing to, or they are heading towards west instead of north on their values, we've got problems. We genuinely will have problems because emotionally, people can only do that for a set amount of time. And it differs. Some people are more effective at managing the fact they are heading towards north west and they should be heading towards north, but do you know what? They're making a load of cash at the moment, so they can negate that. That's not a problem. Or they know that at the end of it, they'll be able to steer the ship back to north, and it's a set period of time that they're going to be partially disillusioned from their value set or their authentic lineup. But these these are some of them. There's more obviously that contribute, but these network of influencers affect people's emotions. Confidence. If someone's flying high or if their confidence has been knocked, how does a non-confident person feel on a day-to-day basis? How does a confident person feel on a day-to-day basis? And how do they act? How do they behave? Because confidence might end up as a behavior, but there's so much that comes before. You can act confidently and then feel confident, but you do have this very intricate relationship with emotions. And confident, I'm feeling happy, I'm feeling joyful, I'm feeling content, I'm confident. No, and conversely, if someone is feeling frustrated or angry or annoyed around a certain aspect that's might be happening in their life, relationship wise, work wise, family wise, then their confidence can start to drop. on a repetitive basis, it can become undermined, and then you can end up with people with low self-esteem, low self-regard, in which case you're in a position where the person doesn't believe their worth or their ability, and then you're in learned self-helplessness to a certain degree, depending on what's come before it. But confidence hugely important, and the triggers that happen on a day-to-day basis, of course, they're going to affect our emotions. That's somewhere where when we're in an environmental situation, what it triggers are in our environments, which are going to influence our emotions and our responses. How do people feel about change? How do people feel about change? It's a great question, which is invariably never asked as a coach. It's like they come in and they sit and they go, oh, I want to achieve this, I want to achieve this. Do you know what you've got to change? Well, I need to change this. Just how do you feel about making those changes? What is the actual feeling that comes up? Sit there for a minute and tell me, how do you feel about essentially shifting your identity and changing it? Becoming a different person who is not everyone's go-to person to be the joker or be the person that always willing to go out and sink 9 pints. How does it feel to change? Because change is scary. Change is a challenge for 85%. There are about, statistically speaking, 15% of people love change and love chaos. I'm not one of them, that's for sure. And I don't think that many people truly succeed well without acknowledging what they're feeling around changes that are going to be happening and changes that they need to make. And change can be very slow and ongoing, which can be and have an emotional effect, or change can be very acute and very quick, which equally has an impact on emotions and how people feel. So just change in itself as a concept and how that influences how people are feeling is so important. But it's another level. It go drops down into another way of thinking about and feeling about something, which is hugely beneficial. How people feel about motivation is something that it's not really a concept which people connect well with when you think about how do you feel about being motivated? Well, I feel it's really a challenge to become motivated. Okay, well then let's look at why it is. And then moving back a step and thinking about goal alignment, authenticity, and values, because actually motivation and perseverance and the ability to gain momentum and keep momentum is often charged by emotions. So, what emotions are you feeling around the actions that you're taking? Because if the emotions don't align, where's the motivation coming from? If you don't feel excited, obviously we have SMART goals is one aspect which we think about. But the reality is there is so much more about how someone feels about actually taking action around something. How aligned are they? Is it externally influenced? Is it internally influenced? What are those feelings? And having the authenticity of those feelings line up with the actions that are being taken kind of starts to look after motivation. Momentum then is gained and results are seen and progress is observed. That's something which it grows into something much more. But the root of that has to be what's being felt in order to be able to get the ball rolling. And we obviously know that relationships can have a massive impact on our emotions and what we're feeling and the people around us, whether they be friends, family, work, intimate relationships, any of those things have an impact. One thing that's probably not acknowledged enough within coaching, and especially I've had people that have come to me and they are feeling within society disconnected. They are feeling alienated. They are feeling that their relationships that they have are lackluster. They don't have potency. They're disillusioned with relationships, and they need to repair the relationship with themselves first and foremost in order to be able to then build better relationships with those around them. And everything that circles around that is the emotional impact that that has. If someone has, as I mentioned, all those things before, and they are feeling low, they are feeling sad, frustrated, lost, all of those things, the coping mechanisms that they then lean into are often maladaptive. And we look at coping mechanisms as a way of people numbing or avoiding or deflecting. But that coping mechanism that is emotionally driven by a poor relationship or several poor relationships can be anything. Exercise can be maladaptively approached. Drugs, maladaptive. Drinking, maladaptively approached, depending on the context. Obviously, alcohol is very much up for grabs for debate at the moment whether people should or shouldn't be drinking. But ultimately, there are tipping points for each of these strategies where it goes. Obviously, some are just clear cut maladaptive, but there are for some strategies there are tipping points where they can become maladaptive, and that's emotionally driven. Optimism versus realism versus cynicism. Who's an optimist, who's a realist, and who's rather cynical about the world? These predispositions will have an impact on emotional well-being. Someone who is optimistic will foster more positive emotions and will likely have a trajectory of more positive emotions. Realism is a bit touch and go of either way. It depends on the environment they're in. Cynicism and that negative approach, the individual will likely see the worst outcome or negative outcomes and consequently have a much more robust portfolio of negative emotions to hand, which isn't particularly useful for a coaching practice. So when you have someone who is potentially more of a cynic, they are always going to be harder to work with when it comes to building emotional intelligence in a positive way and using it as a tool for a trajectory to success. But these are the tasks that we're faced with, is moving someone along that spectrum and starting to have a positive effect on their positioning with regards to optimism, realism, and cynicism. And then creativity. How good do you feel when you've created something? How good do you feel when something has been produced by you? Some of those things are measurable and have net outcomes. Work related is often the case, but sometimes creating something and doing something just because you want to and seeing the output where there's no real KPI that's attached to it or a performance related necessity, just creating something, painting, playing a bit of music, making some pottery, any of those things have a real positive influence on people's emotional well-being. So there's a huge amount of network of influences that we should be aware of as coaches that feed in to someone's emotional well-being. It's not just about, okay, we're aware this is the emotion, this is what we're going to do with it. It's like, well, what is influencing that? What's the network of things? And each of those things can play their role, some more than others, some in combination, some single-handedly can have a huge impact on someone's emotional well-being. But being aware of them is incredibly important. I'm just going to talk here about what I call the North Star analogy. I don't know whether I've called it this or someone else has called it this, but I'm taking this one, so it's mine. The the North Star analogy. I was
was quite some years ago. I was working with someone who was having to make some pretty difficult decisions around business and family, and there were going to be some people that weren't particularly happy about decisions that had to be made, but he was procrastinating on quite a high level around executing the various decisions that he had to make. And it was about selling things and bringing people in and such forth. I won't go into the detail around that, it's not required. However, I asked him what were his top five values and how are you going to be living through those values on the decisions that you make. And the set of decisions that he made, he saw that one going one way would ultimately pull him more away from his set of five values, i.e. his North Star. So the point of the values is you have 5 points, North Star, star has 5 points. So you pick five values because it kind of gives you a bit of an overview rather than two values or 10 values, which is obviously confusing and too much. So five is quite a sweet number. Ultimately, the set of decisions were going to take him either away from it or towards it. Now, each of those values in decision set A or decision set B were going to be affected, some more so, some less so. But by giving some form of calibration of this set of decisions will ultimately, these 2 points will not necessarily be lived through as fully as I want to, but these three will. But then this set, I'm actually going to miss four of my points on the star. I'm not going to be living. It gave a very objective and rational approach to a very emotional problem. We think about like the wise mind, you have your emotional approach, you have your rational approach. Well, actually, the combination of those is the ideological way in which someone can make better decisions. And the North Star analogy was like, what do you feel about these values? Give you a score on these values if you're going to complete this set of decisions. And it gave a very transparent pathway of which that person needed to then travel down and the decisions that need to be made. So it was emotionally driven. He was very aware of how he felt around the values, around the decisions. There was even the reluctancy as an emotion of procrastination and what came with that, the fear of upsetting people or the sadness that he felt that person was going to be experiencing. So there was a whole host of emotions that were considered and linked to the values and then the decisions sets that were going to impact those values. The right decision was made for him, and the North Star analogy was a very useful tool and mechanism in order for him to move forward with his business. What do you think it feels like to be a confident person? What do you think it feels like to be a highly motivated person? I'm asking this framed question. What do you think it feels like to be? Because if we're not aware or have any kind of concept on what it can feel like to be a motivated person or to be someone who is living in an authentic way in line with their values, if you don't and you can't visualize and initially and then absorb what it's going to actually feel like to live like that or to be like that, you're missing a real powerful and impactful modality of coaching. What do you think it's going to feel like? What do you know it's going to feel like? What does a confident person feel like? And it's a game-changing question, which I have asked people I've worked with. Not You don't always have to ask it in a very obvious way. It can be as subtle and intertwined within a coaching conversation. It doesn't have to be a bullish or abrupt asked question. However, to thread this in and to get people to start to imagine the feeling of being confident, imagine the feeling of walking down the street and or imagine the feeling of getting up and hitting the PB you wanted to hit, or imagine the feeling of being able to know that what you're doing and the actions that you're executing are in line with your values. What's that going to feel like? It's a powerful framing of something that obviously cognitively speaking, because you're reframing something, but again, it's bringing in that emotive part of it and really getting someone to sit with it is the key. Once you start bringing in the idea of what it might feel like, and you start to then ask questions about, well, what does that person have to do? You can start to then create the trajectory of what that person will start to execute and how that person will start to exist. What does it feel like to be in a place of authority, talking with confidence, talking with the knowledge you have, interacting with the people around you in a way that you feel is authentic and motivates you and motivates them? What does it feel like? And attaching and anchoring onto those and being aware of them, not obsessive about them, but being aware of them and then letting them exist in your mind is an incredibly powerful thing to do. The power of visualization. You can have visualization on a very wide spectrum. You can be visualizing outcomes, visualizing processes. There are several papers and research around visualization having huge impacts on sports performance. So I'm sure you're aware of the slightly more dangerous sports, which are winter-based skiing for downhill skiing, or you've got your toboggan runs and stuff. The visualization that they use day in, day out in order to be able to actually physically execute the skill, but they also have the emotive part of it as well. How do you feel? How do you feel at the top as you're getting ready to go? This psychophysiological arousal of high risk. And I know we're probably going into an area where working with clients, it's not about high risk, but it's actually relative. So what they see as quite a risky situation could actually create the same kind of feelings of the gut twisting, the chest tightening, stuck in the throat. They can't speak and say what they want to speak about. So actually, we look at sport and we say the power of visualization, the skill itself. Whether if we're looking at training, obviously that's a very mappable execution of a deadlift or whatever that might be. But then when we think about the emotional side of dealing with a relationship at home, which the person is particularly abrupt around nutrition habits, and actually your client has got to have quite a difficult conversation with their partner in order to be able to realign some of those things so it suits their needs. Well, actually, is that a high risk situation? It might well be. How do they feel going into that? Well, they might feel like someone at the top of a ski slope just about to go down the black run. So the visualization of then being able to feel those emotions, deal with those emotions, and understand those emotions, and then take a more powerful position into having that conversation with their partner around their nutrition. And I'm using that as an arbitrary example. There are hundreds of examples where a client has to go in to have conversations or interactions, or they have to do things themselves, which is going to be a challenge. And all of those things create the same kind of physiological, psychological responses that they would do within some, sporting events. So understanding how and what the client is visualizing from an emotional point of view, because this is obviously about emotional intelligence, is really important to be able to build levels of connection, build levels of rapport, and actually share that journey with the client. So understanding that part of the process. I just want to have a parting thought here. You can't be aware without taking time to reflect. And if we're going to create a higher level of emotional intelligence, but not give ourselves time to do that in an appropriate way, we are not starting in a good place and we will not achieve what we want to achieve. I think when we're working with clients that don't give themselves the compassion, that don't give themselves the permission, and that don't give themselves the level of self-care that they should to reflect, will always provide a challenge for us as coaches. We are in a position where the first thing that we should do should be to get a client to be creating a space to reflect. It is the critical step. Without reflection, they will not become aware. And without a level of awareness, they could literally be influenced by whatever's going on around them to do stuff in a very blinkered way with no real execution that is meaningful to them because they haven't taken that time to reflect and be aware. How does this feel? What do I actually want to lose weight? Which is a classic one. People that come in and they say, "Oh, I want to lose weight." Why do you want to lose weight? Well, because I've been told I need to lose weight. Okay, so how do you feel about losing weight? Well, I've never really thought about that. Cool. Well, it's probably a good place to start from. How do you actually feel about this journey that you've come to me to say that you want to go on? And it's not just about weight loss. It can be about anything. It could be about a cross border of, why do you want to do this job? Well, I was told I should be a doctor by my parents. So I went in to be a doctor and I've done, okay, well, let's have a time. What do you want to do? Let's now give yourself that space to reflect. Because if you're just about to shift your career, you've never given yourself time to reflect and time to be aware. So now, well, let's do it. So it's not just health and fitness, it's the broader place where you find that people just don't give themselves that time to reflect. There's lots of ways that people can find that time, the meditation ways in which it can be used as a tool. It doesn't have to be glass baths and all those things. That's great to do that, but meditation can be whatever the individual wants. It actually creates a time to reflect. When we think about awareness and we think about emotions, we can't understand them or begin to understand them unless we have that temporal aspect of reflection. It opens the door to connection. And the connection is something that, as a coach, when you have the inner mirror, this is where you start to become effective. What emotions show up for you as a coach in your coaching, but also in your daily life? What do you get frustrated with? What are you happy about? What spurs you on as a coach? When do you feel the most jubilant? When do you feel the most desperate? Now, these are all holding up the inner mirror as a coach is incredibly important. Understanding where these are coming from. I was at a conference and someone put up their hand and asked a question. I wasn't talking, someone else was talking, but they put their hand, they asked this person was talking, and they were like, I've got this client and she keeps self-sabotaging basically. She keeps getting a bit of results and then she keeps going back again. She keeps getting results and she keeps going back in. And this particular coach, her blueprint, her modus operandi, whatever, was lean, getting lean. And this client that she had had from her earlier days of coaching was like a stick around client. And they never really got anywhere, but they obviously had some sort of connection and relationship. But she was really frustrated. She was like, kept pushing and kept pushing and kept pushing her and kept wanting her to get results and kept digging and stuff. And I was listening to this interaction between the person who was on the stage and talking and the girl. And I said to myself when I was listening to this interaction, it's got nothing to do with the coach. That person wants to, go out at the weekends or have a bit of time and they lose a bit of weight and then ultimately put it back on again. If that's what they want to do, that's the decision they're making, that's the life they're leading, then that's fine. But it didn't fit the coach's what she wanted that person to achieve because it didn't fit her brand, it didn't fit her marketing, it didn't fit her. And instead of being honest with herself as a coach and going, this isn't the right client for me because it's not where my business is or what I want my business to be, she kept trying to get this person to fit a square peg in a round hole and kept trying to bash it through. And I heard this and I was listening to this, but it wasn't necessarily the outcome that was talked about at the conference, but I could hear everything that was being said. And I was like, if you just hold the mirror up to yourself, the mirror itself is an incredibly useful aspect to lean into as a coach and almost a critical part because whereas you might have an approach that you're taking, unless you hold the mirror up and ask yourself questions around that approach, it will never grow or evolve or change, in which case it won't be right for the interactions you're having with each of the people you're having. Your approach will need to change, and you will have to hold the mirror up and ask, is this the right approach for this person? What should my interactions be like for this person? And unless you have that as a critical part of your coaching practice, self-reflection on a regular basis through mirror holding, then you are going to limit yourself with the emotionally intelligent development that you could potentially have. It's a critical part. Growing into better awareness. I'd like to just kind of give those that have been listening back over this, and obviously anyone on the call, over the next week, simply pause once a day and name what you're feeling. And don't necessarily do the same time every day. Do different times of the day, because otherwise that's cheating. Because if you're get up in the morning and like practice gratitude, then you're going to name that feeling quite quickly as being a positive one, right? So try and see at different times of the day because I know myself personally at different times of the day, I feel very different around different things. So different times, different days over the next week, pause and once a day ask and name what you're feeling. That single act of awareness is the first step towards becoming autonomously more emotionally intelligent by just going, what am I feeling? Okay, cool. And then responding accordingly. I just want to finish on the idea of awareness and it's not a one and done situation. It is a battle to maintain this in a world of distraction. Awareness, when there's so much other stuff going on and your attention is being pulled and pushed all these different places, if you're fortunate, someone will have a space to be able to sit and be aware, but that's not always the case. So they'll be aware, they'll go off for 2 or 3 weeks, and their awareness levels will start to drop a little bit. So having the reflection, journaling, there are many different ways that you can be more aware. Pausing once a day, like I just said, and just giving yourself that kind of time. But it is a skill, and skills are only achieved on a long-term basis if they are attended to in accordance and they are given the due respect that they needs to be given in order to be able to stay there. It's not a one and done, it's a maintenance aspect, and it's something that I think as coaches we can be very good at ploughing into some education or ploughing into a particular training modality or any of those things and going, right, that's cool, that's done, I understand that now. And yes, you might understand it and you might be able to then deliver it, But that's not what awareness is. Awareness is a an ongoing thread of behavior, reflect, i.e., the reflection in order to be able to stay self-aware. So there we go. That is our second call on awareness and self-reflection. Hope you've enjoyed it. There will be some resources and some recordings placed in the library for people to look back over and to be able to take any more notes or refresh themselves at whatever speed and whatever frequency they see fit. So thanks for listening. Appreciate that and speak to you soon.